Quick math question. If Canada promises to spend an extra $33.5 billion per year on military, and the top economist says we need massive tax cuts to stay competitive, and we are already running the biggest non-crisis deficit in history, what happens? I'll tell you what happens. The math stops working. This week, 3 major stories dropped that when you put them together, reveal something nobody in Ottawa wants to say out loud. Canada is making promises we literally cannot keep to afford. All of them at the same time. So today, we are doing the math that politicians won't do. We are looking at what Canada actually wants, what we can realistically afford, and the impossible choices we are facing. Because someone needs to be honest about this. Let's go. Alright, let's set the scene. Where is Canada as a nation right now in early 2026? We are at a crossroads. And honestly, we've been avoiding making real choices for a long time. On one hand, we got external pressures. US is threatening tariffs. NATO is demanding we spend way more on defense. 5% of our entire GDP by 2035, up from 2% now. The world is getting more dangerous, and our allies are basically saying, step up. On the other hand, we've got internal economic problems. Our productivity is low compared to other developed countries. Our tax rates are some of the highest in the developed world, and businesses and investors are starting to look elsewhere. And then, on top of all that, we've got political drama. The Carney government is a minority, which means they need opposition support to pass anything, including their budget. And the conservatives are saying, we will work with you, but you need to change some things. So right now, as a nation, Canada is trying to balance 3 things that don't actually balance. Number 1, spending way more on defense to meet NATO commitment. Number 2, cutting taxes to stay economically competitive. Third one, keeping the deficit under control so we don't bankrupt ourselves. And here's the problem. You can maybe do 2 of those, but you can't do all 3. So what does Canada actually want as a country? Well, it depends who you ask, but there are some common themes. We want to be safe. We want to be a strong military that can defend us and meet our obligation to our allies. Nobody wants Canada to be a freeloader that relies on the US for protection while contributing nothing. We want to be prosperous. We want good jobs, rising incomes, and an economy that can compete globally. We want businesses to invest here, not flee to the US or Ireland or Singapore. And we want fiscal responsibility. Most Canadians don't want massive deficits and growing debt that our kids and grandkids have to pay. We want a government that lives within its means. And honestly, all of those are reasonable things to want. They're not crazy. They're not unrealistic individually. The problem is when you try to do them all at once, because meeting NATO's 5% defense commitment costs a fortune. Cutting taxes means less government revenue, and you can't have both and reduce the deficit. The math just doesn't work, and that's where Canada is right now. We want everything, but we can't afford everything. And nobody wants to be the one to say which things we're going to sacrifice. All right, let's get into the details of why this is such a mess. This week, the Parliamentary Budget Officer released a report on what it would actually cost for Canada to meet NATO's new defense spending target. NATO wants member countries to spend 5% of the GDP on defense by 2035. That breaks down to 3.5% on core military spending, tanks, planes, and soldiers, all that. And another 1.5% on ancillary stuffs like cybersecurity and infrastructure. So Canada is currently spending 2% on core defense. So we need to get from 2% to 3.5%. Doesn't sound that bad, right? Just 1.5% points. Well, here's what that actually means in dollars. An average of $33.5 billion per year in additional spending over the next 10 years. And by 2035, Canada would need to spend $159 billion on defense in that year alone. $68 billion more if we stayed at 2%. And here's where it gets ugly. PBO estimates that meeting this commitment would increase the federal deficit by $63 billion in 2035 alone, which adds 6.3% to Canada's debt-to-GDP ratio. That's massive. That's not nibbling around the edges. That's fundamentally changing Canada's physical picture. Now you might say, okay, we need to spend on defense. We have obligations to NATO. We can't just freeload. And you're right. That's a fair point. National security matters. Meeting our commitment matters. But that brings us to the next problem. So this week, David Rosenberg, a well-respected economist, published an op-ed basically saying Canada is economically screwed unless we do a major tax reform. His argument is pretty straightforward. Canada's tax rates are way too high. Our top marginal income tax is over 50%. Our corporate tax rate is 26.5%, and that's making us uncompetitive globally. Corporate tax for Canada is 26.5%, while Ireland is 12.5%. He points to Ireland as the model. In the late 1990s, Ireland slashed its top taxes 40% top personal rate, 12.5% corporate rate, and became a global tax hub. And it worked. Ireland's unemployment is 5%. Ours is almost 7%. Their GDP per capita growth has been over 4% annually. They built a robust economy by attracting investment. Rosenberg's argument is, why isn't Canada doing this? He says, and I quote, Canada needs to become super competitive. I would recommend a complete elimination of capital gains taxes to spur capital investment. Elimination, as in zero, the capital gains tax. Now, here's where this gets tricky. He's not wrong that lower taxes can spur growth. Ireland proved that. The US saw investment surge when Trump cut corporate taxes from 35% to 21% in 2017. But here's the problem. Tax cut means less revenue for the government, a lot less revenue. And if you're cutting taxes while also trying to spend an extra $33.5 billion a year on the military, the deficit explodes, the debt skyrockets, and if you're back to fiscal irresponsibility. So what do you cut? Healthcare, investment, infrastructure, education? And then just to make this even more complicated, there is the political situation. The current government is a minority. They need opposition's votes to pass their budget, and the Conservatives are negotiating. This week, Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer said his party is willing to support the budget bill, which is a confidence vote, meaning if it fails, we would have an election, but only if the Liberals make changes. The Conservatives are concerned about provisions in the budget that would let cabinet ministers exempt companies from federal laws without parliamentary oversight. And here's the thing, nobody actually wants an election right now. Conservatives said it outright. Canadians don't want a $500 million costly election. So the political pressure is to compromise, to avoid rocking the boat, to keep things stable. But that means Canada keeps kicking the can down the road on hard choices. We don't cut spending. We don't raise taxes. We don't meaningfully reform the economy. We just keep going, promising everything, delivering some things, and hoping the math works out somehow. So what's actually changing? What's the turning point? Well, here's what I'm seeing. The contradictions are getting harder to ignore. The PBUR report makes it impossible to pretend that meeting NATO commitment is cheap or easy. It's not. It's $33.5 billion a year. It adds 6.3% points to our debt-to-GDP ratio. If Canada is serious about meeting that commitment, we kind of have to be, because NATO isn't optional. If we want to stay in the alliance, then we need to be honest about what that costs. We can't have $33.5 billion in extra military spending and massive tax cuts and a balanced budget. You just can't. At the same time, Rosenberg's op-ed is forcing a conversation about whether Canada's current economic model is sustainable. Are we falling behind because our taxes are too high? Are we losing investment because businesses can get better deals in Ireland or US? Maybe. Productivity growth in Ireland is 10% annually. In Canada, it's basically flat. That's not a coincidence. But here's the thing, if you want Irish-style tax cuts, you need Irish-style spending discipline. Ireland didn't just cut taxes and hope for the best. They also controlled government spending. They kept their physical house in order. And Canada, we have increased federal government spending by over 50% since COVID. Our population only grew 10% in that same time. So if we want tax reforms, we need to be willing to cut spending, real cuts, not accounting tricks. And that brings us full circle. What do we cut? Defense, healthcare, infrastructure, or do we just accept higher deficits and more debt? So here's where we are. Canada as a nation is facing a choice, actually multiple choices, and we keep trying to avoid making them. We want to be a strong military power that meets its NATO obligations. That costs $33.5 billion a year extra. Are we willing to pay that? Because right now, the answer seems to be sort of maybe. We'll see. We want to be economically competitive with lower taxes and higher growth. That means cutting government revenue significantly. Are we willing to accept the spending cuts that come with that? Because right now, the answer seems to be No, we like our programs. We want fiscal responsibility with controlled deficits and sustainable debt levels. That means we can spend more on defense and cut the taxes at the same time. Are we willing to choose one over the other? Because right now, the answer seems to be, let's just promise both and figure it out later. And that's where we are stuck. Canada wants to be everything to everyone. Strong military, lower taxes, generous social programs, balanced budgets. You can't have all of that. The math doesn't work. The result? We are making incremental moves in every direction without committing to any one of them. We are spending a bit more on defense, but not enough to hit NATO targets without accounting tricks. We are talking about tax cuts, but not doing the fundamental reform Rosenberg is calling for. We are promising fiscal responsibility, but running the highest non-crisis deficit in history. And meanwhile, politically, everyone's just trying to avoid an election. The Liberals and Conservatives are negotiating budget amendments, so they don't have to go back to voters and explain why they can't deliver what they promised. So the result is not much changes. Canada continues to muddle through. We don't make the hard choices. We don't commit to a clear direction. And we hope, really hope, that the world stays stable enough that we can keep kicking the can down the road. But here's the thing. At some point, the bill comes due. Either NATO forces our hand on defense spending, or the businesses and investors leave because our taxes are too high, or our debt gets so large that we can have a physical crisis. The longer we avoid making the real choices, the worse those choices become. Look, I don't envy Canadian policy makers right now. These are genuinely hard choices. There is no right answer that makes everyone happy. If you prioritize defense spending, you're taking money away from healthcare or education or infrastructure. If you prioritize tax cuts, you're giving up that revenue that funds programs people rely on. If you prioritize the fiscal responsibility, you're saying no to a lot of things people want. But what frustrates me is the dishonesty, the pretending that we can have it all. Canada deserves leaders who are willing to say, here are the options, here are the trade-offs, here's what we are choosing and why. Instead, we get vague promises, accounting tricks, and a hope that nobody does the math. But maybe, just maybe, reports like the PBOs and the op-eds like Rosenberg's are starting to force that conversation. Maybe Canadians are starting to ask, what do we actually want to be as a country? And what are we willing to pay for it? Because those are the questions that matter. Alright, that's it for this week. If this video made you think differently about Canada's choices, hit that like button. And if you want more honest breakdowns of the tough decisions Canada faces, subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop a comment. What should Canada prioritize? Military spending, tax cuts, balanced budget? You can only pick two. I want to hear what you think. Share this with someone who's tired of politicians pretending we can afford everything. Send it to your group chat, post it on your story. Let's get more Canadians talking about real trade-offs. I'll see you next week. Until then, stay informed, stay critical, and remember, you can't have everything, so choose wisely. Quick disclaimer. This video is for information and entertainment purposes only. I'm not a financial advisor, economist, or policy expert. Just someone breaking down the news. The views expressed here are my own and don't constitute professional advice. Always do your own research and consult qualified professionals for financial, legal, or policy decisions. Thanks for watching.